The audio you're about to hear was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.
Welcome back to the Alexander Schmid podcast, episode 033. With Mr. Wesley Schantz, and I believe this is the 6th classical conversation we've had on the show, and the 5th with you here now, Wes. Wonderful to have you.
Yeah, well, this one, it's going to be a little bit of a different one, right? I mean, it's like towards the end of our last conversation last week, we started to touch on it, and I know it's something that you've been wanting to think through, and so, I mean, I don't know. Do you want to introduce the topic then? And
right. So I guess it does go in line with the fact that it is President's Day today, and how I take that to mean is that it's a day like Lincoln's birthday, sort of tragedy, and how tragedy can befit how tragedy can be a part of not only the life of a great person, but the part of a great nation. And so we recently suffered a tragedy just a few days ago. I believe it's the biggest mass shooting on a school campus in history, even superseding the Columbine massacre in terms of and number of deaths. 17 dead, I believe, 14 injured. Numbers akin to those down in Florida by an armed gunman, and who had once been a student there but had been expelled, as well as from 2 other schools. Well, the reason I sort of wanted to discuss this isn't simply because I'm a teacher and you're a teacher, and this is a day on which we might well think about national tragedies, but also because the psychologist Carl Jung, and more recently the Canadian psychologist Jordan B. Peterson, say that when something difficult or dark happens, precisely what you don't do is run from it and ignore it. What you have to do is you have to consider it. And so the question that arises when something like this happens, to which we so often get a dissatisfying answer or unsatisfying answer even, is why? And so I don't know. Right. I just so often heard people say why and then shake their heads and then walk away. And so I figured part of the goal of this podcast is to think through difficult issues, both practical and abstract. And this is, I think, a difficult issue in both spheres, because this is, of course, a deeply tragic practical thing that happened, but its roots, Carl Jung would say, go down to hell. And so I thought that we might want to consider the tragedy, and again, keeping the Timaeus in mind and the idea of giving a likely account is the beginning of science, not the end, of course.
Right.
Just getting the conversation started. I thought it might be useful to consider this through the framework of Dante's consideration of exile and what it does to the psychology of an individual. And of course, this is something that Dante compares himself to Christ in this way, because Christ is a willing exile from heaven in his conception. And he contrasts that with Lucifer, who is an unwilling exile from heaven. And the Miltonian Lucifer is also very similar. And so just a couple of facts about the young man who committed this shooting are that he had grown up in an adopted household without a father. And so he was sort of an exile from the experience of the normal childhood that's prevalent in our culture, the mother and the father, and also the biological relationship. When that's severed, that's an exile from 2 levels of normalcy that many people experience. And I had a friend who was, and this is just anecdotal, but I had a friend growing up, and I recall him. He said that there was another friend of ours whom he didn't like for many years, several years, because one of the first questions he ever asked to him was whether he was adopted or not. And when he found out he was adopted, he refused to play with him. And, well, that's even something that Andromache in the Iliad mentions as being a hateful fate for a son, to go about without a father who is not there to beat away the boys who will make fun of him for not having a father.
Yeah, but that's very common also in our society, just kind of broadly. It's
agree.
Telemachus' situation too at the start of the Odyssey.
Right. And Orestes, who does quite a bit with it and, murders his father's slayer. So I'm not trying to take autonomy of the will out of the situation at all,
Sure.
but simply illustrating that this person might have perceived himself as an exile, and as an exile, as I illustrated earlier, there are two ways to understand your position. Either in the sort of Christ-like or Dante-esque way, or in the Luciferian, Achillean manner. And so what are those two ways? Well, Dante well illustrates in his Sphere of Mercury in the Paradiso that if damage is done to you, and so the Sphere of Mercury, from which we get mercantile, from which we get mercurial, it's the sphere of determining fairness. So what's the value of your money, and can we trade with each other, and what do your words mean? And so he determines that if somebody does damage to you, it is within the bounds of fairness for you to do damage back to them. However, he broaches the concern, when does it ever stop then? Because the moment you strike back at them, boom, they again have, by the dictates of vengeance, the right to strike you back again. And so you can fight until you destroy each other, essentially, is what he's saying. But he says, well, that was sort of the power of what Christ did, because imperfect beings put a perfect being to death, which means that it was an unforgivable act. No amount of asking for forgiveness or repenting could make humans forgivable for that. And so the only way that humans could continue to exist in a forgiven or a sort of graced state, graced as in given something they do not deserve, would be if that being forgave them for doing something unforgivable. And that's what Dante says Christ did. And Dante also believes that that is what he is doing for Florence. He is forgiving them for their flaws because, of course, they could not understand him for what he is. And so he's still going to become the ultimate flower of their civilization. And so instead of resentfully burning away and burning in his tent like Achilles, or burning in his hell like Milton's Lucifer, and hiding his abilities away in a Calypso-like fashion, he becomes all the better because of it. And I would say that's one way of dealing with exile, but that's not the way that it was dealt with here.
Well, the interesting thing, I mean, about the two, those are sort of the two extremes, right?
Yeah.
That you could pose as your response to a perceived problem or insult or exile, if you want to say.
Sure.
Right, and then the point at which they meet, right, is in terms of the images of the Christian story is the cross, right? You have the cross at this point of kind of final encounter, and I just found it really interesting that the kid's name is Cruz. And that's the word for cross. So he's carrying his cross, he's sort of got this chip on his shoulder. I think it's really, I mean, that's kind of sort of puts the tingles on the back of my neck, to think about. And yeah, his response was very close to what you might imagine as the extreme, right? Of rebellion and, of hate. And I guess normally, like you're saying, normally people will, make the effort to talk about a tragedy like this, and it's common to hear the question why, and head shaking happens, and you look down and you walk away. But the two kind of alternatives that usually get talked about are not Christ and Satan, but either there's like a problem that's related to mental illness, or there's a problem that's related to guns, or some combination of the two, right? It's
right.
Like,
I mean, I think both of those are attempts at not allowing the shock of a traumatic event to alter one's view of what is happening at all, right? And then both sides two sides are then created who then project their shadow onto the other, which means ranting baboon essentially is what the status of the other side is. And this ranting baboon, which is subhuman in terms of intellect, means that they can't say anything intelligent enough for me to possibly want to listen to anything they say, and therefore I won't listen to anything they say. I'll only listen to the ranting baboons next to me who are yelling the exact same thing I'm yelling, which often doesn't have much content but does involve some vitriol directed towards the other ranting baboons, which are the other side. And so it's like, I just don't see much substance in that sort of conversation. It's looking at things at exactly the wrong level of analysis, and it doesn't help at all my understanding, at least, for what to say to my own students, whom I have to tend to. And I don't know. It just I would say if I were to see the arguments, I could address them individually, but one thing I would not want to do is to say that this was the result of a sick person and because of that was in some way determined by his condition. Nor would I want to say that this was the result of the social circumstance of an individual, because precisely both those arguments, the sort of argument from mental instability or the argument from social circumstance, well, what that obviates is the most important thing that makes a person a citizen, which is the individual element. And what is the individual element? Well, that's the capacity to make a decision, to make a choice. And so the problem with those two views is that they suggest that the circumstance makes the decision. But the problem with that is that that's self-refuting, because obviously everybody in those same circumstances do not behave in those same ways. And so somebody could say, well, his circumstances were unique. And I would say, well, then you can't apply a theory to explain them. Because what you're, of course, looking for in a theory is what's common to the situation. When you ascribe a mental illness or a social circumstance, and you would suggest, then the suggestion, therefore, would be that more people with those circumstances would commit such crimes. And unfortunately, we would, if that were true, we would certainly take action to limit that from happening. But it's not true, so we don't. And so what is true is that we punish the individual. And why? Because they make an evil decision. And that's what we have so much trouble dealing with, because this sort of thing indicates the presence of malevolence in our world.
Mm-hmm. So something that we don't want to confront, right, is that it's really something that's inside of every one of us, right? It's like,
well, see, that's the problem.
Was in that situation,
that's the problem. If that's exactly the problem. Instead of us just being able to stick up our noses and say, because this person has a condition which is not a condition that we have, we don't have to worry about it. Wrong. Precisely wrong. You just have to listen to some Eminem from like 15 years ago, talking about how he's every mother's nightmare because he's the potential within all their children. He seemed to get it. The problem is that if malevolence is in one of us, it is in all of us, which means what? That we can only rely on each other because we have to trust each other, because we're all constantly making the decision to or not worse. And a situation like this shows, dang, it's really easy to make things worse. And it's like, yes, sure. it is, of course.
Right.
Of course.
And so then it's all the more incumbent on you to make the effort, as you say, and strengthen your kind of will and determination.
And your character, because apparently you are going to have to run into Darth Mauls in this world and Achilleuses and people who are possessed by evil thinking or have decided to make, choices that have led them down paths which make them enemies to good and true things. Yeah. And those are people.
It's a long one too, right? Well, so it's like their identity, the people who wind up, bringing a gun to school, trying to cause a shooting or succeeding in doing so. Right there, there's a long path of choices that leads up to that. And
right.
There's not a lot of people that sort of, intervene at some point to prevent many other people from going down that path.
Right. There's another problem I would say with the narrative. And I think you put it well, is that we do tend to be like, man, couldn't people have seen the signs? And the answer is maybe, probably, sure. That's not the problem though. At the beginning of the Odyssey, Zeus says this recklessness of mortals that creates far more strife in their lives and pain and suffering than they normally would endure. And actually it was so weird. I think it was an NBC article I was reading about this. A boy who got paired with him for, I think, a science project said that he was talking to this guy and he said he was just, he was reckless. It was actually the actual word that he used was reckless. And I shared that with my students because the thing is, Aegisthus, who was raised as a brother to Agamemnon, but is actually his cousin, and a really weird and interesting twist of fate for him. While Agamemnon is gone, Aegisthus, wishing to take Agamemnon's crown, seduces his wife Clytemnestra, which is an easy thing for him to do because Agamemnon has tricked Clytemnestra into giving away their daughter Iphigenia as sacrifice, using the pretense that her daughter was going to get married to Achilles. So she goes from thinking that the greatest thing that could possibly happen was going to happen for her family to the worst possible nightmare.
Yeah.
Married daughter to sacrifice dead daughter. It's like, wow. And so, oh wow, I'm losing my train going. That's what I get for these long tangents.
No, you started from Aegisthus, I think.
Aegisthus, yeah. So basically, Clytemnestra has good reason to be angry at Agamemnon. And, so it's easy to seduce her. And Aegisthus, well, he's warned explicitly by Hermes. Do not do this. Yeah. Do not do this. Yes, exactly. Mercury, his own capacity for judgment. And see, that's something interesting about the Odyssey because you get not only influence from Hermes, but also from Athena and the scholarly, I don't know that this is consensus, but what I've read in the scholarship, which I think is, has elements of truth in it, is that Mercury or Hermes as trickster god is morphing into, more Athena or truth god or, competence god, going from that sort of initial foolish roguishness into the more defined wise, cunning divinity. But what I would add to that is that what Hermes does indicate is one's own capacity to think up an ingenious solution to a situation that wouldn't occur to others. And he actually shows up multiple times in the Odyssey to do this. He frees Odysseus, working in conjunction with Zeus and Athena, indicating that they're the three gods who are going to be helping out. They're the trinity of that text. He shows up to help Calypso and in fact says he doesn't much care for it there because there are no humans there. The social environment isn't there. It's not a real place. It's very clever by Homer. He also shows up to show Odysseus the moly the black and white poplar that he can eat to keep Circe from turning him into a lustful or a pig, essentially. And all that goes to say is that why is Aegisthus different from Odysseus? Hermes went to both of them.
Right.
But it was the choice that Aegisthus made. And it was the choice, and the choice is, that Odysseus made. Even back then, 2,800 years ago, we knew that it came down to your choices. And so that's what I think, well, when I talk to my students about this, that's what I think I'm going to convey to them. What the weight of individual responsibility is. Because, I think free rights, man, we're America. It's great here. We can do whatever we want within the rule of law. It's really awesome. And I live in California, which is one of the best places on the planet. That's why I moved here. And, you live in Washington. I'd say much the same.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, that's some of the narrative of this particular shooting is, right, like it's paradise and it's happened in paradise now. So, which I found kind of interesting, because then it sort of skirts the, biblical imagery of the Garden of Eden. And,
I think that's exactly good imagery, because the real paradise that it's shaken is America, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because the idea is that we're the promised land, the land of milk and honey, and that's largely been true throughout history, which is why people have been willing to fight for and expand this place. But the issue is that where's the snake coming from? Oh, well, and this is the issue that Peterson says that Russia is going to have, is that essentially the Soviets tried to keep Western ideals out, but then they generated spontaneously from within because humans have thoughts. And well, where's the snake coming here? It's one of our own. What does that tell us? We have malevolence within the walls as well. We are just as terrifying as the people outside the walls. And so we have to be very good to each other in order to increase the trust we have with each other, because that's the only guarantee we have against each other. I mean, the reason that we are one giant collective unit that works together well seems to be that we are all joined together by the same ideal or set of ideals.
Yeah, if not that, even just like on the level of interpersonal relationships, if you don't have trust in some kind of ideal, maybe at least you have trust in some person that you can go and talk to, that you can, if you have a reckless idea, imagination of doing something, well, at least you can go and talk to someone who can tell you, well, think about it, and then slow you down and kind of be that voice.
That's precisely what I think that we've lost from sort of a Christian or even a Greco-Roman ideal of the divinity that exists within an individual, because then what protects the negotiations between any two individuals, and this is a point that Dante explicitly makes, is the divine, is God. Mm-hmm. The fact that when you agree with somebody, you're putting your trust in the God inside them, recognizing the God inside you, and understanding that God would never betray God. And so you don't ever betray humans.
And so if it looks like it is happening, even if it looks that way, then you have this kind of paradigm of the sacrifice of the son, right? Because he's betrayed, right? But he's willingly taking that suffering on. And so that seems to be where the forgiveness element can trump the rebellion or the destructive element. Maybe it is a thing that is that has been, treasured in a kind of religious context for a long time, but I don't think it's only, to be found there. I think, like you said, it will arise wherever people trust one another, even if they don't, trust the society at large. If they have a role model somewhere. And if you don't, right, if you don't have a father figure, well then, you're in a really tough spot, and it might take some kind of divine intervention to spare everyone your destructive, rage. And it's sort of like where the conversation, I think, would lead you, right? And so you sort of like, you're left as a teacher or as a fellow student, right? Sort of looking around and saying, well, so like, am I really doing everything I can to be a good citizen in this school, to be a good, role model from my peers and from my students? And who are those students? There's maybe a lot of them, but like, who are those students who don't seem to have somebody that they connect with? And what can you do to connect with them, to try to, have a moment, in the rush of the day to slow down and hear what's going on with them. Like, what's their situation? What are they thinking about? Particularly.
I certainly know in general, my solution is to shine brighter and be warmer, you might say. To be clearer in what I demand and what I can share, and to be warmer in my expression of it. and to become more articulated in my delivery of that which I'm delivering, and to make sure the intention behind it is kind, and the meaning behind the words is existent or present in the words, even better. And hopefully uniquely expressed so that they can learn to uniquely express themselves through just seeing somebody do it his own way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important, that it be a genuine feeling and not something, forced, or even like, yeah, just sort of acknowledging the rage, right? Like the rage is so so central to this. That's where the Iliad begins, right? With the rage of Achilles. And that's something that everyone experiences as a kid, and maybe as you grow up, you don't experience it quite the same way, but it's always still there. It can always break out any time. And so, yeah, just kind of like, acknowledging.
Well, I would say to that, to the degree that rage has something to do with this sort of, issue, I would say that insofar as that is the very first word of the Iliad, of the very first, story of Western civilization, it's the issue of integrating aggression into the personality, which is something on the social level we're having massive difficulties with right now, right? We're even trying to drug aggression and law, and ban aggression out of existence by law, right? Yeah. We're making it so that people cannot compete in an aggressive format, even though we're giving massively conflicting signals, because of course aggression, linked to combat is something that, especially if one is good at expressing oneself in an aggressive, way, one can climb dominance hierarchies, particularly, sports ones, which can lead to extremely high dominance hierarchy status in terms of wealth and money, which do seem to be wealth does seem to be the big indicator, even since back in the time of Agamemnon.
Yeah, a big marker, yeah.
A big marker, for sure. And perhaps we can make some claims about Odysseus markers and things like that. But, wealth's a pretty easy one. We give a lot of money to people, and that means that we value what they do. And one of the things we do give money for is, success in sports, particularly football, baseball, and basketball. Though not exclusively, certainly. Soccer's coming up in America quite a bit. And so
aggression is like, it's permitted and channeled in certain ways in our culture, but then in other spheres, it's just like totally outlawed. So it seems like, there's some kind of contradiction there.
Well, and I mean, we were talking about, and Sarah and I were talking about how women can outperform men in high school because of their quicker developmental progression and not having to deal with the increased levels of toxic testosterone in their systems. And also now, frankly, with the fact that their reproduction genes have turned on, they now have to deal with the fact that they feel how low in the dominance hierarchy they are. I think that's something that we haven't given enough credit to. Like all of a sudden, like 13, 14, it's like you're a guy at the bottom of a very tall mountain and you can feel the weight of it. I think that's what we joke about when we joke about high school being hard for young men. It's like you're at the bottom. And if you're at the bottom in your high school, you're at the bottom of the bottom. And that doesn't feel good at all. And so, well, that's the sort of thing that can, if not dealt with appropriately, breed resentment and say you found yourself at the bottom of the bottom and you couldn't even behave appropriately enough to maintain your existence in that institution, then you might imagine that you've become the sort of person that revels in the fact that you cannot behave correctly anywhere and has started to understand your story to be person who doesn't fit in anywhere and gets kicked out of every possible place. And so every possible place must hate you and be bad by nature and thus deserve to burn.
Right. Which is, in a certain way understandable, but then there's better stories. Precisely.
Yeah. That's the issue. That's the Anakin Skywalker issue, right? It's like, yes, you can do that, but it's not a capability issue. It's a moral fabric issue. It's what do you build in doing that? What are you trying to accomplish? Because it's actually fairly obvious what this sort of thing is trying to accomplish, right? To destroy not the trust between those particular people, or not even to just kill those particular people, as awful as that is, but to destroy the trust that exists between the people who survive.
Yeah.
That's the goal. And so
misery loves
the idea, right? And the idea is hopefully people start yelling at each other for some pointless reason about this rather than coming together and helping. And it's like, people are already helping, right? The nurses and the doctors that worked on the victims, the first responders who came there to help with the situation and put the situation down and control the situation, the counselors that are helping, all the people that have grief, the people that come that have to clean up the schools, and have to clean the blood up from places. Those people are helping a lot because most people don't want to do that. And it's like, people are coming out of the woodworks helping on these sorts of issues. And I think that needs to be recognized just at the most fundamental levels. It's like people immediately go back to work trying to pick up the pieces after this sort of thing. It's like, you can understand how it is that we can come back to maintain a civilization after like a large scale war, like World War II, just because it's like, I think what we're supposed to take from this is things are supposed to get clearer, not more obscure, that you put things back together better. And so you have to understand your values in a clearer way. It's like, oh yeah, this is a trust issue. We need to trust each other more, not less, because, well, the less we trust each other, the more this sort of thing will happen.
Right. Yeah. And that's a great, I mean, I've not thought about quite on that level, but I think that's a great response maybe to the kind of, cynical viewpoint that looks at this and sort of throws up the hands and says,
well, I don't even understand the cynical viewpoint in that way, because it's like if the cynical viewpoint is actually cynical, it should expect this sort of thing and not care, right? But the fact is that they would throw up their hands and say, oh my gosh, look how this proves what I'm saying. And it's like, no, it doesn't. You care. You can't even not care. What you're angry about is that somebody doesn't know the truth, which means you're angry at yourself for being so intellectually lazy that you figured out that, dang, we don't know everything. And then you said, well, we don't know everything. How can we know anything? So I'm just going to give up. It's the laziest way to think possible. And I see how it develops because that's the level to which it develops, and it often develops in high school.
Right. It's a kind of arrested development, if you like.
Yeah, it's exactly arrested development. That's exactly right. It's like, that's the first thought you ever got to, and then the first counter thought, you thought, man, thinking's tough. Because when you actually try and think, you run into obstacles. It's like, yeah, that's the point. Thinking is a sharpening stone. The more you do it and the better you get at it, the larger the obstacles you can move for the people around you and in conjunction with them.
Right.
And, we can build things even grander than the pyramids in terms of abstraction and the things with our minds. I mean, I would say that's effectively what the Republic is. It's it's a podcast that goes a whole night, right? Right. We should try and do that some night. Maybe if we could get, like, say 100 listeners, or something like that, we could do, and maybe like a symposium and do something like 7 hours and, see if we can put together the ideal state in that amount of time. Because if we can't do it in 7 hours of concentrated effort, whenever could we do it, frankly?
Right. I think the Republic and the Symposium, those are two kind of interesting dialogues to juxtapose in that regard. And isn't Dante's whole story supposed to take just like a few days, right?
Yeah.
It goes,
and it was a visionary experience, sharing a vision with people. And and I think more and more we're going to have to do that. And, I think for the next 50 years or so, which is about the amount of time I think I've got slotted for us to do this, God willing, is, we need these fireside chats. I think something interesting about media and digital media is that TV, as brain rotting as it was when we were growing up, came on at the same time. And there weren't that many shows, and so we shared a lot of the same shows and a lot of the same movies and doing things at the same time. But now TV is a much more personalized experience, often personalized to somebody's laptop or even tablet device. And so you find people not watching TV together, watching all sorts of different things, which means that people are sharing fewer and fewer stories together.
Yeah.
Fewer and fewer stories together at the same time, which I would argue is, well, you know, Peterson says, where is the book? Is it in the pages? Is it between you and the pages? Is it in you? Is it in the people that have read the books? And I think the same with any sort of story experience, right? Like, you're there with the crowd you're there with when you're at like the ballet or at watching the Nutcracker, or you're watching the symphony. You're not simply there with the music. You're there with the people playing the music. You're there with the people listening to the music. And so it's a slightly more unique experience than the words generally used to give, than the words used to describe the experiences, which has led us, I think, to forget that the essence of the experience, not the description of it, is what's meaningful. And so coming together in order to share an experience, which I believe is the Heideggerian coming together in order to gather idea,
right,
is what we're starting to lose. And so we have infinite fast food, but we can't sit down to dinner with each other. What do we miss? The information sharing aspect of meal, the ritual aspect. We made it ritual because that's when we all sit down and share information with each other, which bridges or creates more bridges between each other, which bolsters our relationships, which makes us stronger or more arc-like when tragedy hits. Mm-hmm. And so even though we can get a lot of food more conveniently, that was never the whole point of sharing.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's much the same with the TV. Like that's like family time. And TV was a cheap way of doing that instead of actually paying attention to each other, which would, be, vastly superior.
But maybe just asking too much, after a day of work and school.
But now it's even less than that because people in the same room, but two of you have headphones on, watching their own tablets or cell phones or mobile video game system like a Nintendo DS. Or multiple ones, more likely, depending on age. And so, it's as if we really are becoming more solipsistic, but solipsistic precisely because, we richen and deepen our experience when we share stories and experiences together rather than just words.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of a school, which seems to be kind of, up and open to question now, right? It's like, well, there's probably some more efficient ways to like convey this material to people, maybe, but what do you give up with that, right? You give up the ritual element of it, the habitual thing of getting up and going to school and seeing your friends, and seeing the teachers and there's, maybe there's an inevitable movement that's kind of, tending to isolate people. But if that's the case, if that's the march of the technology, then there can also be a corresponding and kind of, a movement of will and of diligence on the part of people to reconnect in the face of that and, recapture some of that, that connection, with.
So we should observe the problem and then address it, not just observe it and then marvel at the problem.
And then be kind of washed away, right? Yeah, like the arc image there,
It's like, times really are terrible. It's like, well, okay, so what can we do about it?
Building, let's get.
It's like, we got to get to work. Right, exactly. That's exactly the point of addressing these sorts of issues. People say, well, how could you? It's like, well, someone's got to.
Yeah.
It's like, who is this putative other person who's going to think through all the issues of today? Like, nobody's thinking about anything of value. And so that's why we actually have to come forward and start saying what we think about things, because people potentially they'll at least say, well, God damn it, you're totally wrong about that. I totally think you're full of crap. And it's like, well, at least that's something. Maybe some people will also come out and say, man, when I thought about, I always thought about it that same way. Or, you made me think about that in a kind of different way. And it's like, well, that's the whole point of sharing some thoughts, I would imagine, or I hope, or I mean to do, or I think we mean to do.
Yeah, it's a matter of maybe just kind of like we were saying the other night, like kind of finding that place where whatever takes the place of the old market or the old agora, and if it is a matter of kind of making a bigger, maybe it is a matter of getting a bigger kind of event together, kind of leveraging some existing institutions.
Yes.
To start getting a bigger group of people to cooperate on something like that. And so like there's like I mentioned, the schools, which I think this is a podcast which is appropriate for, pretty much anyone who's patient enough to interact with it, listen through it. Like it's on a level that I think people can access. But I think it's a cool idea. You're talking about maybe doing some about movies, and you mentioned Harry Potter and
yes.
Yeah. So if that takes place, I think that also would be a really good way to kind of pitch the ideas at a level and in an arena where people are kind of already, interested in things and might spark some further ideas. So
that's something I'm deeply interested in doing, because something Peterson brought up yesterday in just one of his many, many YouTube videos was he was being asked by Rogan, I believe this is Joe Rogan podcast 1070. Actually, I can confirm that that's true. And Rogan was like, oh, well, you're gone from teaching. You have a sabbatical right now. And Peterson gives an explanation explaining that it was going to be a year in the future, but it was better to take it this year because of all the controversies. But he should be coming back in January, but he vacillated on that. He said, well, according to plan. And Rogan pushes him on that, and he says, oh, what do you mean? And Peterson says, well, I can only just, do the 25 things I have to do in a day and go one day at a time, because who knows what's going to happen. A very Petersonian answer. And, but he also said, well, the thing is, I've already videotaped several years, 3 years, occasionally, almost 4 with his personality lectures. He's like, I've taught those classes, and video exists of those classes now. He's like, I just did the Bible, and his idea seems to be, well, since we can videotape our lectures, we can go through a course one time and then move on to new courses. And that's not to say that going through courses multiple times doesn't have infinite value. It certainly does. And it is a different course every time you go through a course, for sure. And definitely when you listen to his courses, that's true. He's thinking through new thoughts all the time while coming to similar patterns. And I think it's a very similar idea to why you go to the same musician's concert in different places or at different times, right?
Yeah.
Like it's going to be the same but different. And so it's going to be the same enough to where you like it, but different enough to where it's interesting.
Yeah.
And that's a cool thing about teaching courses multiple times. That said, I'm very interested in doing the same sort of thing, on bringing my mind to bear on new topics, on new texts, on putting out, I would love to put out a lecture course on, say, every single text in the traditional great books canon is defined by, say, Mortimer Adler, or even using, say, a great books text list, like a seminar list from, say, a St. John's or something like that. I don't know. I see that as an activity that could take infinite time, that also has potentially infinite value, not only as a product produced, but as a sharpening stone in that you are producing yourself against the greatest works and the greatest thoughts ever to have been thunk, and you're attempting to think them up and distill them down, yourself, which, Emerson says that's the whole point of reading, so that you can have your own thoughts. And I would say that is literally the point of books, that thoughts that have been come to through strenuous effort and time and, crazy acquisitive strategies like going down to Africa, for instance, and learning everything, while you're, say, like a 19th century British explorer about, say, rhinos. It's like, yeah, I'll read a book about that. That's pretty cool. That was hard to get knowledge. That was hard to get information, you know? And all I have to do is read.
Well, yeah, it's like, to the question about where is the book, in some sense, the book is everywhere. It's in the past, it's in the future even too, right? It's like, it's this kind
because
of,
its value may be unrealized still.
Yeah. It's this kind of or like port key, is that the word?
Yes.
The thing that you touch that takes you somewhere else, and that's sort of, it's kind of it's no wonder that we think about, wizards with their books,
a symbol, right? Yes, and that's interesting because I do a lot of thinking about Hogwarts, seeing as I am, a high school teacher, and at a place that actually has a 4-house system. I'm head of Excelsior, which is Gryffindor, because we are red and gold. We have a lion mascot, which we call an Excelsior, but it's very much like a lion. And we represent the twin swords of courage and kindness.
Nice.
And so thinking about, port keys a lot, and it's interesting. The wand is that from which the spells come, or you use to cast magic. And well, to spell, Alan Watts makes this point. To spell is to cast a spell on someone. We do that by means of speaking.
Yeah.
In fact, I think those skilled in prestidigitation, sleight of hand, magicians will say that's precisely what's happening, is that people come for the story. They want to be fooled, they say. And it's not so much that you want to be fooled so much as you want to be entertained. And so you'll listen to them. You will grant them their conceits. You will follow what it is they wish for you to follow in order to get the maximal story experience. And so you don't need to humiliate yourself through saying you wish to be fooled. It's like, no. See, because these people are getting exactly what they want, a meaningful experience they pay money for. It's like, yes, they've got it. They're doing the right thing. You need to perform, though.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because we like to be guided by somebody who sees the meaning behind a story. And I think that's the idea of the Wizard of Oz, right? That the sorcerer behind the curtain is the one who's running the whole myth of Oz, and he happens to be just a person.
Yeah.
And so again, we come down to the idea, I think, of personal autonomy, of personal choice. It's like, what do you want to represent in the world? And it could be something glorious like Oz, or it could be something inglorious like, the witch. Who's trying to destroy everything and get those ruby red slippers. I haven't thought much through, the Wizard of Oz and what all the imagery means. Though I do often mention to the students when we're teaching them about the lotus eaters, poppies, and the fact that scholars do believe that lotus may have been some sort of opiate. Certainly has the sort of characteristic addiction, or mentally addictive properties. The men have to get tied up to keep from jumping back into the stream.
Yeah, no, so the thing about the wizard, right? The Wizard of Oz is, that he's been, creating this kind of grandiose, story, and then is revealed to be just a little guy behind the curtain, right?
Right.
And that's in some way, kind of the danger too, right? Like,
yes, now I'm seeing it's a pandemonium sort of thing, like what Lucifer does, refusal to serve in the real world. And so, the idea I think might be something like the measure to which you live out your dreams don't need to inflate you by. And so the less and less you live out your dreams, the more and more you have to dream your life away. And so your dreams get bigger and bigger while you get smaller and smaller. Whereas the better life is the one where you become your dreams, where your dreams help to push you into the zone of proximal development, and you further inscribe yourself, further define yourself into a unique and, uniquely competent individual with a unique experience and embodiment of the soul within the world, you might say, or the conscious experience within the world.
That's what I like about the idea of doing these maybe smaller series, or just like even one-off discussions of some popular books and movies and things
Yes.
is that they sort of act as these kind of experiments within which you can see some things
Lightning rods.
about the integration of a personality, right? And
Yes.
about the elements of dream and reality that they're sort of revealing to you, that they are, you know, to you.
And
or
the aggression. That's something we should see. We should see the fact that the aggression of the modern American is not integrated. That should come through in our movies if that hypothesis
Oh, no kidding,
is correct.
Oh man. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like, if that's an element of wish fulfillment, then there's a lot of unfulfilled aggressive wishes out there. And I think distinguishing between reality and fiction or fantasy is hugely important, right? Like,
sure. Well, and also understanding their properly informative role. It's like, we are biological entities. We don't produce nothing for no reason. You know, our art comes from somewhere. It comes from our right brain, effectively, right? It's our first order approximation of what's happening in reality. And so the poets and the artists, and the musicians, they pump out some weird, seemingly nonsense, like images on a palette, or some weird words strung together that sound good that we like to dance to, or like some crazy poetry that we're like, yeah, I like listening to this, but I have no clue what it means. It's like, well, why do you like to dance to this? Why do you like how it sounds? Why do you like this? It's like something in you is responding to it. Mostly your right brain, because you'll generate imaginary images when you're listening to music or to poetry, right? Or even a very good speaker, you'll even stop listening to them, and you'll just sort of let the words wash over you. And imagine you're in the crowd during like a great speech, which is sort of funny. But what you're supposed to do with that is interpret the art. Because it's something thrown out there by the brain, by part of the brain that is not as articulate as the left part. So the right part with its, you know, sort of, imaginary images, which can even lead to, say, visions if somebody is, say, under a hallucinatory experience, as Peterson suggests, through your feelings and emotions, which of course you don't control those. And if anybody's like, don't be angry, you understand exactly how little that helps. Like, don't be annoyed right now. Don't be annoyed with this bad advice I'm giving you right now. And also with dreams. And it's like, why, we can't just ignore the fact that all of these things are major parts of our lives that we experience I dream almost every night. Mm-hmm. And it's just, that is a fact of existence. Why does it happen? It's like, oh, here's why it happens. That's your right brain sending you data that it has interpreted in its first order approximating way, which your left hemisphere, this hemisphere of order as opposed to chaos, needs to sort through in its articulated manner. How does it sort through in an articulated manner? It has to talk about it. It has to describe it. This is why therapy works. This is why seminar works like therapy, and this is why confession works for people, and just having good friends around them, right? Then you get to articulate what it is you've experienced and what you felt, and you can you can be like an etiologist. You can seek the cause of the thing when you articulate it, and then remove the anomaly. So it's like, why do I always feel bad after I talk to this person? Well, you talk to somebody else, say we talk to somebody who's a great conversationalist like you, and you're like, oh, it turns out they're actually really negative, and they put you down 30 times every time you talk to them. It's like, oh, well, now you understand. And now you can actually pattern behavior in order to limit that person's effect on you so that you don't experience that negative effect anymore. And it's like, now you have a strategy instead of just some vague and anomalous and negative feeling that you kind of try to ignore, but which controls your interactions and makes you feel weak and incompetent.
Exactly. The sense of something becomes concrete and therefore something you can like act on or whatever. But that's
like expecto patronum. You're a dementor. You like produce this defined image you produce a defined image of light in order to understand just how vague the thing was that was accosting you, and therefore define the problem so that you can solve the problem expecto patronum.
But what I would point out, I guess, is that I always like to sort of reinstantiate as well the value of the amorphous, of the felt, insofar as it's the thing that sort of connects you to other people in the first place, right? Like you can connect to people.
To nature.
Yeah, you can connect to people on a logical and kind of discourse level, left brain level, but you definitely also do connect to people through the music or through the art or through, those kind of experiences.
Well, that's the feeling of the connection, I would say. Like, without that, there's nothing to articulate for the left brain, right? Yeah. Like, I think you just through left brain, and like, you even see this in movies and things when, say, the archetypal, girl who's finding herself and therefore her soulmate is talking to her best friend who's slightly less together than she is, but also slightly prettier. So she dates more. So she's doing better and worse. So they're good friends. She's describing some guy to this girl and then all of a sudden realizes in describing that she loves him. She's like, how did I come to this? It's like, well, you've been acting as if you did this entire time, right? You've been behaving in this way and you've been imagining him in a certain way too, perhaps as Prince Charming or even having thoughts of, say, marriage or children or something like that. But only in addressing those thoughts and those images, those feelings and those actions you've been taking and expressing them to another person does it start to click, to the connections between them, suggest themselves so that you can articulate them. You're like, oh my gosh, like marriage thoughts plus going on like dumb cruises plus like really liking this person so much. It's like, boom, that equals, I love this person. Or something like that. So yeah, certainly the left brain is it is by no means the most important aspect of you. It is, at least interesting from a biological level, it's both the most and the least important part of you. So say if your left prefrontal cortex gets damaged, or at least in cats, they've taken them out, they become hyper exploratory, but they just can't learn new things. And so you can survive probably pretty well without an actual consciousness. In fact, it seems that your consciousness sort of inhibits you from taking all information in, which is another comment made about Peterson about the likely effects of, say, psychedelics, though he does not, what is it that he says? He does not say that I'm trying to use the wrong word, prohibits, but it's not that. He doesn't approve. There we go.
He doesn't endorse it, right?
He doesn't endorse. There we go. But he does mention the fact that that's probably what happens with something like lysergic acid, that the inhibitory structure of consciousness sort of fades away, and so the massive amounts of information that are always underlying our experience that, say, perhaps a baby sees, or an animal, whatever inhibits the fact that we can't constantly see all that we don't see starts to disappear, and that's overwhelming. And in fact, supposedly that's what happens with trauma, right? That one's worldview is shocked so tremendously by a direct action, an action that seems to reach all the way down to hell, right? Because say you're somebody from a good Christian family in Iowa who's never seen anything terrible happen and has only ever seen, nice, good, wholesome things happen and has only ever watched movies where that sort of thing happened, and you're all of a sudden doing the worst thing possible to some small villager, and then boom. Why would you develop PTSD? Well, because not only would you have seen something evil happen in the world, you would have seen yourself perpetuate. And this isn't my example, actually. There's another one from Peterson. And it's like, what does that do? Well, that creates a hole in your picture of reality and therefore your picture of yourself and who you are, and therefore what you're striving towards, because you no longer know who you are, and so you don't know what you're supposed to do because you don't know where it is you're supposed to go or where you belong. And so you have to restructure where that hole was. You have to completely rewrite the story with now the presence of an actor in it, which was not present before, and that actor is a giant force. The dark side, right? Voldemort, evil, comes through in all our movies, our biggest stories.
I think I think you can probably all movies. I would agree, but definitely within ones that are sort of trying to do something a little bit deeper than just just make a little bit of money and sort of like move on to the next thing. But
sure, the major epics.
Yeah, anything with a slight pretension to quality, probably.
Well, yeah, and that people will stand outside of for days and pay in mass hundreds of millions of dollars, not only to make, but then to go watch. It's like, that's a phenomenon that we have never seen ever in the world. People spending that much money on anything. And so, I mean, and it's for stories. And we're actually driving the technological field in order to produce these stories in better and better ways.
Yes. And, so there is a thing there that is connecting people in a really humongous way, right? Even as other smaller ways might get eroded, and need to be kind of buttressed. But yeah. No, so I think getting a chance to do some of these, side stories and how they touch on elements of personality that still are seeking to be integrated, or however you want to kind of characterize it. Yeah, I think that would be really, really interesting to.
And something I wanted to piggyback on that. I do want to do, and I definitely want to do the side quest ones. Is something I thought would be interesting for our listeners would be, I know that you had a special connection to Earthbound growing up, or otherwise known as Motherhood, and the character of Ness. And I never got through that movie, but I did, or that video game. But I remember you speaking so highly of it. I definitely need to. And, maybe if we can get down and, do this in person one of these times, we can, maybe we can play through Earthbound or something like that.
That'd be so fun.
But I first learned about that through Super Smash Bros. And I thought it was very interesting. I read some literature on Earthbound, especially Mother 2 or Mother 3, and the intentions behind the writer of that game, where he said he wanted to betray the player. But I was a big Final Fantasy VII fan growing up, and particularly I liked the character of Sephiroth, and I thought it might be interesting to sort of talk about our particular childhoods just a little bit and how, say, our own lives might have reflected the games that we liked and the characters that we found most provocative within them, and how that may have set the trajectory of our lives. Because, I didn't get to the Iliad until I was 20, 21. I didn't have it growing up. Yeah. And so I didn't have the great characters from the Western tradition in the same way that some people used to. I wouldn't say most people have now. So for me, a lot of the major characters came from novels, and sports heroes and heroes of culture, but also from video games.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were such a huge part of, growing up in the 90s, that era of video games, those RPGs for some people maybe, but I mean just in general, playing games with your friends, getting together and playing Mario Kart or whatever, like that was the thing to do. So yeah,
I can remember a lot of my values about friendship came from Final Fantasy VIII, and to this day. And I would say that I've read Aristotle now, I've read Cicero, I've read Dante on friendship, I've read the great thinkers, and it's beautiful all that they have to say, but they say much better what is also said by these video games that help to define our generation, or the stories that we would wish to live out as a generation. And I think it'll be an interesting call to our generation to remind them of the sort of games that we played growing up, and of the sort of aims that we had within those games. And they were certainly noble ones. And so I think rather than being the resentful generation, which we've often been labeled as with good reason, we have also a good chance to set our aims higher, to be a noble generation instead.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good bookend to where the conversation started here today, and certainly one that I'm looking forward to continuing another time.
Yeah, and we can set up the particular, say, shows or movies or short stories or parts of stories we want to go through. I really love the idea you're coming up with here, laying out the idea of being a little more topical with some of the things we talk about in order to root some of our creative reflections, and also just to give as a model for teachers who are doing seminars and starting conversations for the first time. Just to sort of show them how a creative conversation can go. So we're both pretty creative in terms of temperament, in terms of the big 5-factor analysis. And so I think it's a little easier for us to get going than it would be for, say, just anybody, because so an aspect of creative thinking is lateral thinking, which means we produce lots to any idea. And so we sort of have a lot of different directions we can go from the get-go. And we're pretty good at doing that because, well, that's part of our professional training, right? St. John's. And then, how we've, conducted ourselves for the past several years. So not something that happens overnight, but something that can be trained and like with all skills and can be improved upon. And so I would hope that other teachers feel confident enough to engage in these sorts of discussions, not only with each other, but also with their students.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's amazing because you're not, at a certain point, you are training them and helping them get started, but then there's great moments where the conversation just takes off and it's like, time flies and it's just wonderful. So I think it's by far the most fun and most beneficial way to teach, any age group really. But,
high praise. And
for kids who never have, like me growing up, I very rarely got to, do any discussion type things in classes, but, for kids to get a chance to do that kind of learning at a younger age, I think is just a really wonderful opportunity here. So and I think I would say too that if people are listening and have things they want to talk about, just like call in and share them and suggest topics.
Yeah, actually, could I ask? Let me ask you about that really quickly, and we can end with that. How you called in before you were ever invited onto the show? Could you just quickly explain how to do that?
Oh yeah. Okay. So if I recall, there's a little button down there, after the show's over. It sort of gives you a little button that you can push to call in. And
it's on the Anchor app?
Yeah, on the Anchor app. Yes. And so when you do, you have to hold the phone up to your ear and then there will be a little sound that lets you know that it's recording. Yeah, it's like that. Exactly. And you start to talk and then you kind of figure out what you're saying. And then as soon as you do that, you'll hear a sound that lets you know that the thing is going to stop recording. And so it chops up your call into these very small, kind of units. And then I think on your end, I think you get to hear those units and sort of stitch them back together again somehow. But to the person calling in, just so you know, you've got a kind of limited time and then you can, start again and do the next part of your call, but you just have to.
I think you might have 5 minutes. I think how it works is that when I'm just giving my podcasts independently, I can go for 5 minutes and then I have to take a pause. And so I'll often pause every few minutes or so, which is sometimes why there's some inelegant cuts in there. And I gather my thoughts in order to think something through and then I'm back. Poof.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I think ultimately, especially talking about movies or video games, things that have a strong visual component, it seems to me that YouTube is really the way to go. So I think making videos of those kind of things will be more fun and more interesting.
Well, I'm looking forward to doing that with you. And I just got a new MacBook and I have a new display monitor behind it to do some more serious audio visual work. And, and I'm just so appreciative to have had this opportunity with you so far, Wes. 5 conversations in. That's a infinite amount more than the 0 we had done before this.
Right. It's I think a strong beginning, but like you say, if there's 50 years worth of things that we're going to talk about yet, then we're just scratching the surface here. So
and I guess we're going to have to keep reading and learning new things and doing new things so we can stay interesting to people.
Oh man. Yeah. Well, thank you for, kind of being the impetus to get this whole thing started. And I look forward to seeing where it goes from here. Yeah.
Yeah, let's mount the troops and let's storm Troy.
Right on.
All right. Till next time. Thank you very much. This has been the Alexander Schmid Podcast, episode 033. Thank you to Mr. Wes Schantz, and we'll have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
The audio you just heard was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at Anchor.fm.